Hello and welcome to what could be the first and perhaps only gossip edition of Lightways at Life Astrologer, because I am joined today by Victor Olliver, who seems to know quite a lot about people in the upper echelons of society, shall we say.
Well, I couldn't put it better, really. And of course, I'm a Gemini, as you're probably bored hearing now. And what a better sign to, well, you call it gossip. Actually, it is gossipy. I mean, we are going to be name dropping in this, and there are no horoscopes. So if you're expecting Nerdsville, you will be very disappointed, people. We are going to, I mean, originally, as I've explained, I gave a talk to the Northern Lights group in Blackpool sometime last year. And I've got all this research. So it's not like I've just been picking up little bits of footnotes here and there. Everything is sourced. So when in a minute we turn to the attention of our glorious King Charles III, there are quite a few surprises coming up about him and his relationship with astrology. So it will be name dropping. And what I propose to do, talk a bit about royal family, talk about what we call elites, the creme de la creme, but also there's a lot of celebrity as well. And of course, in the past, I was a showbiz journalist. So we can talk about Lauren Bacall maybe at some point.
I'd like very much to talk about Lauren Bacall at some point. So yes, I jokingly referred to it as gossip, but of course, what is gossip? Gossip is the lives of people. And as astrologers, what are we doing? We are people watching. We're understanding, we've got a filter through which we perceive and understand, which is astrology. But what our subject really is people, because this is about people. So when we're looking at those who are in the public eye, we are informing ourselves. It's not mere curiosity about their lives. We are actually watching astrology at work, which is why it's interesting. So there's you, showbiz hack. Were you at that point already interested in astrology? Yes,
although it was a graduated interest. And the first thing I did, to make you laugh, hadn't at that point studied astrology in my, let's say, 30s, early 40s, hadn't studied astrology. But I did buy Russell Grant's Astro Kit. And it's very simplistic astrology. I mean, it didn't take much consideration about location. So they were very basic transit charts. And so sometimes I'd go to a celebrity and produce the chart. And I was going to talk about King Charles III, but since you've asked the question, the Lauren Bacall one was quite interesting. As we know, she was the great Hollywood icon. As monstrous as she was reputationally as in the person, I was actually granted 20 minutes in her presence, and she turned up 5 minutes late. So I had 15 minutes, and we took an instant dislike to each other. But to add to it, and this is a story against myself, but then I got a story from it, you see, because I actually did her chart, but because it wasn't locationally accurate, things weren't in the right places. And who told me that? Lauren Bacall. She knew her chart inside out. She knew everything, where Venus was, where her nodes were, everything. And that gave me my story, because for about half the interview, she was correcting me. So you can imagine from a showbiz point of view, on a personal level, I was feeling humiliated. But as a journalist, I was thinking, I've got my story. I don't have to do anything. Just make a fool of myself. And she spared me nothing. She was merciless. And the final thing I always remember, guess who collected her for lunch? John Gielgud. And the final image was the two of them going out of the hotel.
Glimpses into other worlds.
And just to go back, you're quite right what you're saying about people watching. But one of the reasons why I put this talk together, and I may actually develop it into a short book, actually, because there are books about celebrities and astrologers, but I don't think they're very complete. They tend to be perspectives from practicing astrologers talking about their clients and things like that, like Penny Thornton, for example. But one of the reasons I did this is a reminder that no matter all the opprobrium that's put on astrology by so-called scientists, and other media commentators are just trying to be smart, really, even though they go and consult astrologers themselves privately. I could name names. But what I'm trying to do, I might do it, is what I'm trying to do is to remind ourselves just how immersed astrology is in the culture, past and present. And if our leaders and notable figures are consulting astrologers, what do they know that the rest of us don't?
Do you ever get the feeling that there is a deliberate attempt to cloud everything for the public?
I think there is a basic truth in what you say, but I'm always nervous of it sounding like a conspiracy theory. Not that I'm suggesting you're a conspiracy theorist. I think that there is a kind of groupthink. If I think about journalists, for example, is there a fatal flaw in journalists? Well, that's a terrible question to ask. And of course, it's not the best way to make friends. But there is one feature of journalists that I find interesting, and it is because they're always wanting to be seeming to be in touch with everything, they also don't want to appear to be gullible. And they tend to have a lazy attitude to things which don't seem to be scientifically validated, because they think that science is the only arbiter of truth. So what you get is this dismissive sort of attitude to astrology. And also, if you think about the BBC, not my favorite organization, people like Justin, where these leading journalists on like the Today Show, on Radio 4, are routinely rude about astrology because they've got immersed in what they think is science.
Well, it goes deeper than that too, because, when we have historically the Vagrancy Act, which stipulates very clearly that if you are producing charts for people, then you are committing a crime because nobody can predict the future. Therefore, this is fraud. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether you and the client both believe in what you're doing, it's still a crime because it's fraud. So you have that historically. And then, of course, more recently, we have the wonderful, and by the way, I forget every time to remind everyone that this is for entertainment purposes only. So, yeah, we have the stipulation that we must inform everybody that this is for entertainment purposes only. And we know, you and I, and many others, that the people who are making these policies and these laws, many of them are using astrologers themselves. That's why I asked the question.
It's very interesting. I'm not starting this the way I thought, but that's the joys of conversation, isn't it? I'll give you an example. Now, John Major was Prime Minister of Great Britain for 7 years, going back a bit. He used to be called the Grey Man, if you remember. And now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that he consulted astrologers, but it's most fascinating that his very first biographer happened to be someone called Nesta Wynne Ellis, an exotic creature, may I say, and still with us. And not only did she write raunchy novels, or bonkbusters, as they used to be called. Oh dear. The seriousness of me as astrologer is going downhill, even as I speak.
It's okay. We can always start talking about draconic astrology to get you out of that very soon.
We are not going to talk draconic astrology. We'll talk about the sex life of dragons, if you like. I've got a bit of gossip for you there.
Only want rescuing into the more serious side.
But Nesta Wynne Ellis, not only a bonkbuster novelist, and also a very highly regarded journalist. She used to do the political column for a very big, grand magazine called Harper's and Queen, which is now mutated into Harper's Bazaar, may I say. But the point of the story is this. She actually is an astrologer too. And she was assigned to interview John Major before he became Prime Minister. And when they met, and I've got photographs of them, so this is not a speculative or mythical story, she told him that she was an astrologer. And then when he became prime minister, and she wrote to him, reminding them of their association and of her forecast, he agreed to cooperate with the first biography, which she wrote. And she tells lots of stories about how he didn't directly ask her the question, but he was most interested in what she did. And so invited her maybe to tender ideas about when would be the best time to hold an election or not. In actual fact, the dates that she selected, he didn't use. But the point of the matter is, there is that strange area where politicians will actually consult astrologers. Now, believe it or not, in Britain, we actually have an astrologer MP. And when I became editor of the Astrological Journal back in late 2015, I put in an interview to the guy. He's called David Tredynick, and he's the Tory MP for Bosworth. And unfortunately, the interview was published at the time of a general election. So guess what happened? The interview went up, and suddenly somebody sent the story to a newspaper. And so for my very first issue, just about every newspaper in the land had headlines all over the place, basically taking the pee out of him. And I remember Frank Clifford saying to me, he said, oh, I flew back from America, and all I could see were headlines at the airport and the Astrological Journal and David Tredynick. Now, David Tredynick is interesting because he is a serious practicing astrologer. And he told me in the course of the interview that he is consulted by other politicians. You're not surprised, but there are people out there that have the old smelling salts out, especially if they're Tory voting.
Well, I wouldn't be casting aspersions on any party, actually. But
I would.
I'll leave you to do that. But I think what you're saying is that there is a certain sector of the population that is more small c conservative, and therefore perhaps more careful or suspicious of things that appear to be not quite scientific or fall foul of religious tradition and belief, etc. And I think that may well be true. And in fact, it obviously is. So it's one thing to want to hide that you believe in something that might be considered unorthodox. But it's quite another to actually start legislating against it while you're practicing it yourself. And so that is what makes me wonder what really is going on behind all of this. So is it that they want to appear okay for what they think the masses expect of them? Or is it that there's something else going on? And, you know, it could be my Pluto conjunct the ascendant, but I have to ask the question because it is somewhat suspect in my mind that you do one thing and you then legislate another. But then again, they do that for all sorts of things as well. So
I think we're talking about the realities of groupthink. You know, every age has its prejudices and biases. You know, we talk about the so-called enlightenment. It's itself a laughable phrase if you think about it. This idea that the shedding of mystical perspectives, religious perspectives, somehow is enlightening. I understand what it means. You know, we become enlightened as the physical processes, cause and effect science. We now know that Mars is not some angry god, but rusty. But that doesn't actually necessarily contradict the symbolism, you see. It just builds on it. Just to finish the thing about Tredynick, which partly answers the point you're making, that the newspapers were playing on a common prejudice against anything that can't be scientifically validated, and therefore teased Tredynick in effect. What was the effect? What was the overall consequence of that politically? He was returned with an increased majority. So there is a disconnect, I feel, between the media and, let's say, power Those are one end of the spectrum, the establishment. And then you've got the people. But within the establishment, and I can say this as a fact, there is rampant consultation of astrology, not because they depend on it or rely on it, but they want that perspective. I can tell you, there is one of the Prime Minister's wives consulted me. I'm not going to obviously name that person, but I'm prepared to say that in public. And it's as well to understand that although we're sold this line, particularly by the media, this misrepresentation of what we do. I mean, it's interesting about The Guardian. Take The Guardian newspaper. It's actually one of the worst of newspapers in terms of misrepresenting astrology. For all its liberal credentials, it's actually one of the worst.
Well, I have to say that in my experience, the more liberal they count themselves, the worse they actually are. And that's because they are presenting themselves as being rational and having the answer to everything, which actually is a form of orthodoxy. So it is my experience. It's, and you talked about the BBC, and I've done so much astrology work on the BBC. I have been a BBC producer for the World Service myself, and as well as a presenter, and I've written for them. And when I became an astrologer, it was like a natural thing to be doing astrology on the BBC, and I did it on local radio stations, etc. Been doing it for a number of years for Radio Jersey, and it was their most popular feature.
Of course.
And the producer was absolutely gutted when from on high, she was told that she had to ditch that feature because it wasn't scientific.
Yes, in fact, the problem is not science itself, but what I call scientism.
Absolutely.
I think we should keep using this word. And what is scientism? It's the turning of what is a absolutely valid, legitimate, and priceless thing that we have called science, and turning it into a kind of cult with virtue. And you get it with Brian Cox, for example, Professor Brian Cox, otherwise known as the former pop star of Dream. I can't think of better credentials. And, he's been routinely rude over the years about astrology on his Wonders of the Universe, where, funnily enough, the books from that series, he's actually depicted looking like a deity, because you see his mug sort of hanging in space, surrounded by celestials. I mean, he's Zeus himself. And we've had lots of Twitter spats, he and me. And the most recent one was that he said to me, astrology is no better than voodoo. And I wrote back and I said, well, what do you know about voodoo? End of that conversation. We've got the coronation coming up. Shall we talk about King Charles III for a moment?
Yes, let's.
Would you like that? Because it's name dropping. Now, King Charles III is going to be coronated. Of course, this is going to be seen for years to come. We get trillions of viewers. So, but as we speak, we're speaking before the May 6th coronation. He's clearly not consulted an electional astrologer, that's for sure. I'm not saying anything more. But the point of this story is that there are a number of things to be said about Prince Charles and King Charles, because some of the stories I'm telling is about Prince Charles. But one of the big stories about Prince Charles is that back in 2016, he paid a visit to the Sophia Centre at the University of Wales. And as you know, that's run by Nicholas Campion, or Dr. Nicholas Campion. And he runs the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology. And in 2016, Prince Charles was invited to visit the University of Wales. But I am now told that he specifically asked that he wanted to visit the Sophia Centre itself, where they have the MA, and to meet some of the graduates. And he met, I think, 8 or 9 of the graduates. Now, some people say, that's a bit of nonsense. Well, think again. Can you see this?
The light is bouncing off it, but
yeah, I'm sorry. I've put a blur on the background, but I didn't realize that it was going to blur everything else. But take my word for it, it shows Prince Charles meeting the graduates at the Sophia Centre, and that he asked specific. Now, you could say, well, that doesn't prove anything. Well, I think it proves something, that he's interested in myths, and that came up in the private conversations that he had with the graduates. And if you have any doubts about that, he then wrote a book 20 odd years ago. I was going to put that up too, but obviously it's going to blur, so we'll abandon that thought. But he wrote a book called Harmony. And I'm going to see if I can find some. Yes, I've got it here. It's called Harmony, a New Way of Looking at Our World. And he wrote it with Tony Juniper, the well-known ecologist, as you know. And what comes through is his sympathy for myth and also what he called ancient astronomers, but what he means astrologers. And he tells the story, and I'll read this section because it tells you how immersed he is in the subject. It's about the Tudor Queen, Elizabeth I. And he writes, he's writing of John Dee. Dr. John Dee was the court astrologer to Queen Elizabeth. And of course, he drew up the coronation chart for Queen Elizabeth, as you know, to make sure that she had a good ride with her crown. And he writes, this is Prince Charles, as he then was. He writes, Queen Elizabeth I's astrologer and a remarkable individual. Intriguingly, he may have been a spy for Elizabeth when he traveled to Poland and Prague. I am told that when he wrote to her from such places, he signed his letters with a curious combination of symbols, 2 zeros, sometimes connected by a bridge, implying that he was her eyes, followed by an elongated 7, which happens to be an alchemical symbol for Mercury. As Mercury was the messenger of the gods, the implication is rather clear. Dee was the Queen's secret and mercurial messenger, and he evidently signed himself 007. The Ian Fleming, who created James Bond, was influenced by Dee because he himself was into alchemy and cryptology and things like that. And of course, as you know yourself, in alchemy, 7 symbolizes the spiritual forces that regulate the cycles of time and human developments. And there are other areas in the book where he doesn't specifically endorse astrology, but endorses all the myth and the cyclic patterns of the planets. So he wouldn't have been allowed to endorse astrology, but he comes as close as doing so.
Well, what he's demonstrating is a very deep knowledge of the esoteric, because he's clearly knowledgeable about alchemy as well. So there's something there about, and we know he's been very interested in homeopathy, is a great defender of homeopathy, for instance. So there is definitely an interest there. It's like you said, the disconnect between what they believe the public think and what the public actually thinks is extraordinary, because why not just be open about it?
Yes, I agree with you.
That's the key. Why not just be open about it? And instead of which we have this nonsense of pussyfooting around, pretending to be something that clearly they are not. And on top of which, there then are legal parameters that come in to, in some ways, devalue, debase, and curtail astrology and other esoteric activities.
Yes, definitely. And fortunately, there's a basic common sense that it's probably not a good idea to legislate against astrology. But what you've got instead is a form of distortion and censorship. Now, take the Daily Mail, for example. I mean, the Daily Mail wasn't slow in ridiculing David Tredigny, I can tell you. So what was it? One of its major sources of income in that particular period? Jonathan Kahner's Astro phone lines.
I was thinking about that exactly.
He made £2 million a year.
Yes.
And you can be pretty certain that that was a cut from the bigger cake. And there are many other examples of this. I mean, it's very interesting what happened to Shelley von Stronkel. I mean, I don't think she'll mind my mentioning this because it's common knowledge that she was the astrologer to the Sunday Times for 20 odd years. And then she was removed by some idiot editor who herself got fired a few weeks later afterwards. And divine justice, I always think. But you see, she was a very popular part of the story of one of the supplements that they produce, and that she was replaced by some fashionable agony aunt, you know, laughable really. But there was quite an outcry about it. But the prejudice, the baby boomer prejudice, you see, because you've got a lot of baby boomers now, fortunately, they're retiring or just dropping dead. I mean, I can say that because I'm a boomer myself. But I've noticed that the boomers were the least tolerant of the generations, because the generation before were much more open to not just astrology, but to, shall we say, non-rational approaches to life, and were prepared at least to give it space. Of course, it's very strange that, to bring this back to myself, because I can't resist it, is that back in 2011, I ran a blog called Madame Arcati, which actually drew in a lot of celebrities who are interested in astrology, including Boris Johnson's sister, Rachel. And she was then the editor of The Lady magazine, and she wrote to me privately to say, oh, would you like to do something for The Lady? And I said, well, I don't know anything about cob nuts or strawberries. I don't think I'll be much use to you. And she said, well, you must be able to do something. So in the end, I said, well, I suppose you could write a horoscope. You could do with a horoscope. And she was, I mean, I'm not suggesting for one moment that she endorses astrology. She never really showed much interest in astrology. But nonetheless, she created the space, and I'm still there as I speak. And I mean, there's more to be said about Prince Charles as well, as he then was. The most extraordinary thing, we all know Penny Thornton, don't we? And she wrote a book called With Love from Diana. I mean, she got in a bit of trouble with the astrology world for what was perceived as indiscreet revelations about a client. I'm not going to get into that. But there is something that's been overlooked in some of the coverage about this story about Diana, you know, his then the first wife, who, if she was still alive and if the marriage had survived, would now be Queen Diana. And what's interesting is that it's revealed in the book that it was Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew who actually first introduced her to Penny Thornton. But guess who knew about it from the word go? Prince Charles. Because in the book, she says that Prince Charles said that he was immensely grateful for what they had done. In other words, to set up the consultation with Diana. So when people now routinely ridicule Diana as being flaky for consulting astrologers, they seem to forget that our king, reportedly, he's never challenged the story, was in it from the word go. And while I'm on the subject of royalty, there's the interesting story of Queen Camilla. And another Cancerian like Diana. Just a quick story, because it broke in October 2022. She's not that old. But you may remember this story. She was flying back from India, and the plane she was on was hit by a bird strike, and actually came very close to a crash. Fortunately, by some miracle, they managed to survive it. But it was revealed in coverage that she was coming back from a holistic health center called Sukia. You may know about this. It's an international 30-acre holistic health center in Bangalore, run by someone called Dr. Isaac Matai. I think that's how I'm pronouncing it correctly. And it emerged that she'd stayed at this center a number of times. I mean, it's nearly $900 a night, by the way, nearly $1,000 a night. And of course, the type of Ayurvedic medicine that they practice there is strongly connected to Vedic astrology. Well, and this seems to have been lost in all the reports.
Well, I had the experience of working for a very exclusive clinic in Belgravia for a few years, which was founded and run by one of the doctors to the Queen and Buckingham Palace. And I would say that most of my clients chose to have therapy with me because of my astrological credentials, as well as the fact that I was a clinical hypnotherapist, because they were looking for that lovely holistic approach, the holistic word in an approach to therapy. So I can say that this is definitely something that runs right through certain parts of society. It's just that it's secret, whereas with the public, their interest, where it exists, it is open. So it's very interesting to hear your perspective and your experience as well.
Well, I think we're kind of agreeing, aren't we, that despite all the public appearances, we're all paying to scientism, because most of the people that we're talking about are really not scientists at all. What they're doing is trying to align themselves with what they think is the only arbiter of truth. I mean, going back to the Radio 4 program, I call it Good Morning Professor. I don't call it Today anymore, because just about everybody on the show is a professor, this, that. Now, I love professors. Some of my best friends actually are not professors. But, but every other, hello, good morning, Professor. Blah, 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 blah. And even if it's examining the nature of chip size, they'll get some professor of chip size from some obscure university in Canada to validate the great truth. Whereas, in fact, a lot of the things covered is psychology, is sociology. Are these sciences? Are these actually sciences? They certainly are robustly pursued. And there is research data and things like that. But you see, it's interesting how certain truths are presented and 5 minutes later are contradicted by another research paper. Oh, let's get another professor on. So you've got this cult, this monstrous regiment of professors. You know, even when the COVID thing was at its height, the professors couldn't agree on anything.
No, that's right. And that is natural. It is natural that there will be different interpretations and different views. And, you know, the scientism aspect is something that, let's just say it's a bugbear with me as strongly as it appears with you. And I can remember watching cookery programs when I was still watching TV. That has long been switched off for 3 years. But I, in disgust over many things. But the thing that used to really almost drive me to apoplectic was watching cookery programs where they wanted to tell me the science behind. And it was clear that there was a BBC mandate to educate the public about science.
Oh, yes.
From absolutely every possible perspective. And I quite honestly did not fancy being lectured whilst watching the Great British Bake Off. I really didn't. I wanted to learn some techniques that were going to help me decorate my cakes and be a better baker. I did not need to be lectured on science. I am, I hope, educated and intelligent enough to understand that science, that chemistry is a part of cooking. Thank you very much.
Well, yes, indeed, chemistry goes to the core of a lot of different things. But if you want to whip up your Bunsen burners, the new candles, put them on the old altar, otherwise known as the lab desk. But it's very interesting about the so-called impartiality or partiality of the BBC. I mean, I'm not going to get into the political stuff, but it's worth pointing out, if you are going to talk about impartiality, it's not just about politics. It's also about giving a voice to the various different contributors to the culture and the zeitgeist. And if we accept the principle that an awful lot of celebrities, and we'll come on to a few celebrities in a minute, if we accept that within the world of celebrity, actors, singers, and so forth, film directors, I could tell a few stories. If we accept that people who actually help shape our culture are themselves consulting astrologers, you would think that the BBC, in all its impartiality, might give a voice to them rather than just putting some local radio nonsense for the odd little dip in, you know, when there's an event and asking an astrologer, what's the moon doing today?
And in fact, they stopped doing that. I mean, I don't know if they've started again, but they stopped doing that because I used to do so much local radio, and they were phone-ins. They were great fun phone-in. So that, it's funny. We start off, I introduce the program in a very tongue-in-cheek way as being about gossip. And here we are talking about censorship of astrology. Because
but it all comes from gossip too, because we're actually talking about key individual. I mean, you're not going to get much higher than the king if you're into, Capricornian hierarchies. And so if the king himself is showing a certain sympathy to the underlying principles of astrology, I'm not suggesting for one moment that he's fully fledged endorsed it, but if he's showing all the lineaments of interest in astrology, then I find it very interesting. And you've broadened it out actually then to remind us of the interest. Incidentally, Isaac Matai still works for the king, the guy behind the Sukhya Center in Bangalore. But if we accept that at a certain level in society, you've got all these shapers and shifters consulting astrology, you would think that they would have a voice within the population, as opposed to sun sign columns and the odd celebrity astrologer who's usually compelled to write some foolishness about Mercury retrograde, or what is going to happen when a solar eclipse happens, which is all a load of rubbish, really, because most of it's written already by the editor.
And here we have, again, we're talking about censorship, and which goes against the spirit of freedom of expression, which we are meant to have in our country. And freedom of religion, I would think, implies freedom to believe whatever you want, and allowing people to make choices instead of being patronized and treating everyone either as being incredibly stupid and gullible or fraudsters. It's highly insulting to the population, apart from anything else. So what do you feel your glimpses into these lives and their relationship with astrology has shown you?
Well, it's really that astrology remains as potent as ever. And it's the potency of it. I mean, I'm suggesting people, that celebrities or royalty, allow their lives to be run by astrology. No good astrologer would allow that to happen anyway. But I do think that it's worth reminding ourselves just how immersed astrology is in the culture. It also points to the fact that there is spiritual interest. It may be expressed in astrology, it may be expressed in other ways. I mean, going back to the BBC for a moment, the only time they allow the non-rational is if you've got a formal religion. They don't mind having Justin Welby on to give thought for the day because, he's Archbishop of Canterbury. But it also happens to be the case that the Christian faith is surrounded by symbol. And there was a time when astrology was part of the Christian tradition. I mean, a lot of people may not know that the first astrology book in Europe was actually written by a Catholic priest, Richard of Hereford. I mean, read Chris Mitchell's work on this. I think I've got that right. It's just from memory. And also, if you talk about Pope Clement VI, he consulted astrologers. He actually avoided the Black Plague thanks to an astrologer who gave them advice, to lock himself up basically and stay away from certain conditions and sit in front of fires because he saw it in the chart. So I'm giving you a slightly rambling, long-winded answer simply to demonstrate something, that we are being constantly misrepresented by the media, usually by people who don't really know what they're talking about. They make assumptions about what they think astrologers do. They think that, and then at the other side of the coin, amongst the formal religions, you're tinkering with the mind of God. Not that I've noticed. I don't know anything about the mind of God. I've not had access to the mind of God.
Well, I'm not sure anybody has, actually, whatever they might purport to have experienced. I mean, however, again, what you're talking about really is the need in our society to have the discussion graduate from freedom of religion to freedom of belief. And I think that that's important, because I think you're right. There is a very deep spiritual hunger within humanity. This is a human thing that for most of us, there is a spiritual hunger. It speaks to a need for meaning in our lives. And so it feels as though our society was hijacked through the Enlightenment by materialist notion.
Yes.
And it's left people hungry for something that is not just about rules of morality, but that actually has meaning behind it. Reading the Bible is a beautiful thing, and looking at the Old Testament, not from a literal perspective, but understanding it as a psychological exploration of humanity and human experience and the relationship between humanity and divinity. It becomes one of the richest, most amazing and beautiful books, looking at everything as being about our relationship with this planet and with spirit is a deeply enriching thing. And the reason we are so starved of that is precisely because our culture has been hijacked by materialist thought. And people have been patted on the back and told, don't believe what your gut tells you, actually. Only believe what your eyes
are told. In other words, there's a power grab going on here, or we have to have this monstrous regiment of professors to tell us what's real. And if you're sort of disagreeing with it, or that you're some kind of fruitcake, in effect. And that the reason why I'm a little bit hostile to the BBC, although I also acknowledge its cultural heritage and stuff like that and its contribution. I mean, this is not a BBC knocking rap, but if you're setting yourself up as an impartial organization, you have to, and to take in what you've just said, it's not enough just to give some space, little boxes to formal religion. There's much more to spirituality than Justin Welby or even the Pope. There are so many other approaches of a spiritual nature, mystical nature. This is not about trying to control people. It's about that thing that King Charles himself has addressed in his book, Harmony. And in a funny sort of way, you've actually encapsulated the basic message of that book, which is the understanding of the cosmos. We're part of it. The cosmos is part of us. And also the whole relationship with nature. I mean, one of the reasons why we're facing such catastrophe in the world is because of the disconnect, this Cartesian disconnect between soul and everything else that's seen to be exploited. And of course, to be fair to scientists, they're doing a pretty good job. We've got AI ready to take over our jobs. We might get AI astrologers. You may yet have to interview a robot astrologer. Can you think about that, Anna Isabel? You may have to end up interviewing an artificial intelligence mystic Meg.
Yes, well, you see, this is again where I part company with progress. That's where my line is drawn, because call me old-fashioned and rather quaint, but I rather believe in humanity. And I rather think that it's a beautiful thing that should be cherished and respected, because guess what? It's part of the universe too. We also are part of this planet. We also are part of the universe. And if we're busy wanting to save the planet understandably and safeguard the animals and the plants within it, how about we also place those safeguards on us and grant us the dignity that we all believed that we had and were entitled to?
I totally agree with you. And I think we just got to keep pushing that message. You know, that's the main thing. And yeah, I think you said it. I was trying to think of something else I wanted to say, but you've basically said it. You know.
Well, it's not often that you and I might run for words. I think our thoughts have caught up with us.
Well, the show has taken its own direction,
as it often does.
But the fact of the matter is, we still have the starting point of the reality of. I mean, at one point I did want to make in response to what you were saying. We were talking about celebrities, weren't we? But in the last 2 or 3 years, there've actually been some very interesting features in magazines like Vanity Fair and The Atlantic and the New York Times, and even in The Guardian, would you believe, trying to understand why so many millennials, the so-called millennials, have so taken to astrology. And you see this on TikTok. I mean, Taylor Swift, for example, bless her heart, contributed to the sexification, I've just made a word up, sexification of the Mercury retrograde. She actually put out a video. Another example, you see, because she's heavily immersed in astrology, as is Katy Perry. And in fact, they had a feud. And what actually brought them together again? By examining each other's sun signs. Now, to us, it may sound naive, a little bit primitivo, but the fact of the matter is, there's the starting point. You know, I've said to you before, and I'll say it again, there's no point knocking media astrologers just because you want to be a pompous old professor. There has to be a public interface. People don't want 6,000-word essays with 93,000 end notes. You have to have the face of. Even Brian Cox is the face of physics. You don't think that he's going to be going into physics proper when he's presenting his TV. He's not even really an astronomer. It's just that he knows where things are. He knows the temperature on Uranus, which is where I put him. Or Uranus, as the Americans pronounce it. But going back to my point, the millennials, and it's amazing how in their millions, and what is it? We're going back to the point you made, and this is the point that I wanted to acknowledge. Because we are so controlled by scientific truths and professors and God knows what else, they are trying to find spiritual expression. They're trying to find meaning. And admittedly, you know, you're not necessarily going to find meaning in a sun sign column, but you'll find something, because what that column is doing is inviting you to consider yourself in relation to the cosmos, no matter how banal the language may be. It's a little space for you.
There is, and it's also a portal into the world of synchronicity.
Yes.
And that is the valuable thing, is that the essence of living in a magical world is to understand that there is interaction between you and something else.
Yes, exactly.
And if you pick up a horoscope column and you read it, you dismiss it, but it sticks in the back of your mind, and then later in the day there's an echo, what that does is it says, oh, maybe there's more to this world than meets the eye. Or, I'm right, there's more to this world than meets the eye. And enough of those little things that happen, and it could be your way into finding your relationship with the divine. And that's very precious.
Yes, and there's no set route to it. You don't have to follow the astrological part of that road. You can follow another part of the road. But I think we're hitting on a very important point. Perhaps a point worth repeating is that we should be very skeptical of what is told us via the media, not because there's some grand conspiracy theory, because I'm afraid I don't have much faith in conspiracies. But you can get a kind of default conspiracy where a lot of people are going along with an attitude. It's not so much that there's a mind, it's actually mindless, because no one is big enough to think it through. And if you've got quite powerful producers and directors deciding in advance the agenda, then you don't have impartiality. What you've got is propaganda. Good morning, Professor.
Absolutely. And actually, I would say that that to be true of policymakers as well,
Oh, yes.
because the policy is made and then the narrative is created to support it. And you're right, that is propaganda. And this is then how we end up with, and the logic behind this still eludes me, but with a requirement that anything that is deemed to be fortune telling has to be insured and for entertainment purposes only. Where did that need come from? That's my question. And I have yet to find somebody who can answer it. Were there people being, cheated out of their life savings by so-called mediums or so-called astrologers or fortune tellers, tarot readers? Is that what was happening on a grand scale, that we had to legislate this? No, I think that falls, in my mind, to prejudice.
Prejudice, that's what I was thinking.
And where did that originate? And that's the question. So I guess we are in an era of Neptune in Pisces. And we've used the word propaganda several times. We've used the word censorship several times. And I think that's because what we are collectively working through is that Piscean question of what's truth and what's not, and what's real and what's not. And hopefully, at some point, we will come out of the fog into some understanding that encompasses the best of Pisces, which is real tolerance, not virtue signaling tolerance and compassion. And I think when we get there, I shall be all the happier.
Well, I put some faith in dear old Pluto. Totally endorse what you said about dear old Neptune. Always my favorite planet. But Pluto in Aquarius is very interesting. Of course, in astrology, the great thing about astrology is its plurality and its ability to take in so many different perspectives at once. And we saw that when Pluto entered tropical Capricorn back in around 2007-8, banks suddenly got into trouble. What happens when Pluto goes into Aquarius? Oh, a bank gets into trouble, but this time Silicon Valley. And we're going in the direction of high tech, the internet, and all that stuff, social media too. So on the one hand, and also artificial intelligence. Now, the point of the matter is this is the double-edged sword. I think Pluto in Aquarius will definitely accelerate all the scientific progress, if you want to call it that word, in terms of technologies and things like that and artificial intelligences. But the other side to it is going to be increased factionalism. You're going to get, and we're seeing early signs of this already in the way certain groups, without naming them, try to own subjects, try to shut people up, try to deplatform, and all the rest of it, cancel culture. You're getting these very, very censorious approaches. I saw an interview that I don't want to name names, but I saw an interview with a certain person who has to do with student unions and things like that. And she couldn't take on board the idea that if you deplatform, you're actually censoring. What she tried to do was to say, but we represent people. If they decide they don't want someone, that's democracy. Well, that's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is censorship. So what we've got on the one hand, a fantastic acceleration, but also potential combustion of the technologies. I mean, we see already problems with Twitter, don't we, and Elon Musk and stuff like that. These are the early signs of what is to come. But also this awful tendency to think in dogmatic terms and to try to exclude those we think are dangerous to us.
But I think actually that this is more a product of Pluto in Capricorn, because all of this has its seeds with Pluto in Capricorn, which has always, it seems, tended towards very domineering, top-down control.
Yes.
And my hope is actually that with Pluto in Aquarius, what we are going to see is actually true grassroots movements coming forward and perhaps uniting. I think, we need to understand and remember that the opposite of Aquarius is Leo, and that's individuality. If we are going to have a society or a world in which we are truly embracing Aquarian ideals, we have to remember that a choir is made up of individual voices, and that not all music is harmonious. Sometimes it's discordant and it sounds chaotic. But if we truly want to have harmony, we have to make space for discord, because it's through that discord that we begin to understand. And I'm thinking of your two celebrities who had their spat and then looked at
Katy Perry and Taylor Swift.
And the sun signs. And this is again the role of astrology coming in, because it's reminding us that through it, we can begin to understand what it is, or imagine what it is to be the other. And when we can imagine what it is to be the other, then we're truly bringing in the compassion of Pisces and the opportunity to be harmonious in a way that Aquarius would, the ideal of Aquarius would be.
Yes, the dark side of Aquarius is collectivization and ideology, of course, as you know that. And I admire the fact that you're taking it. I mean, we should be positive all the time, because it's amazing what humanity has to go through. It was taking the scenic route to some kind of enlightenment. But, I'm always trying to bring this back down to celebrities, aren't I? You can tell I'm a celebrity hack. But there's one thing we've been talking about, the interest of celebrities and royalty and whatnot. But let's remember that when astrology is really working, when I say an American president allows himself to be influenced by an astrologer, look what happens. You don't have to love Ronald Reagan. You don't have to love dear old Nancy. But the fact of the matter, talking about censorship, you won't find any so-called legitimate history book mentioning Joan Quigley. And yet, for about 6 years, she drew up the daily diary for President Reagan. And people talk about how flaky he was, and maybe he had early dementia and all this nonsense, or he was dominated by his wife. He was one of the few presidents to leave office as popular as when he got in. His presidency, for all its faults, was horribly going right. And if you read Joan Quigley's book, it's a marvelous book, it's very well written. It blows your mind just how much they were influenced. Now, that goes slightly contrary to another point we're making, that we're not dominated by astrology. But it's worth remembering that practical astrology can work if you allow it. You don't have to be dominated by it. Even Nancy Reagan made her choices.
But this isn't about being dominated by it. It's about being informed.
Being informed, exactly. And of course, we are ongoing creatures. We make judgments. If the astrologer gets it wrong, they're fired.
Absolutely. So, well, I feel hopeful. I think that we have an opportunity to rethink our world. Long ago, when I was thinking about, the Aquarian age and Pluto going into Aquarius, I remember saying to my students, the challenge is going to be for us to hold on to our humanity. And I had no idea of how right I was. I could feel it. I could see it.
Anyone would think you were an astrologer.
Yeah, I could see that this was going to be the challenge. And I think the day has come. I think actually the easy part of Pluto in Aquarius is going to be to find ways to harmonize and get over the nonsense factionalism that has been exploited by top-down politics. I think the hard part is going to be looking at that Pandora's box of AI and the now Parliament approved, I think, legislation that allows for genetic editing of all life on Earth.
Mm.
That, Pandora, that's going to be the challenge for Pluto in Aquarius. And I think, well, we need to decide, what are we going to do? The box has been opened. Can't pretend it's not happening. And the majority of people have no idea yet the level to which AI and this tampering with genetics has gone. But they're about to find out. And when they do, I wonder what's going to happen.
And it's worth reminding ourselves too, I mean, we've known about AI for a long time. I mean, it was anticipated by even Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke back in the 60s. But it's worth reminding ourselves that it's only been of late that serious questions have been raised about the extent of AI. And of course, Elon Musk and about 1,000 others actually signed a letter to that effect. And it all happened just as Pluto was dipping into Aquarius. So to take a positive spin on it, you could say that at long last, there is some force looking at the democratization of all this. In other words, where are the people's voices in all this? Were we ever voting for AI? Or are we supposed to take science determinism? Oh, it's happening. We just got to accept it. Don't be a Luddite. We're dealing with something much bigger than spinning machines.
Absolutely. We are dealing with something that, as I said, the challenge is going to be to hold on to our humanity.
Yes, that's the best way to put it.
Yeah, and I think, well, let's see. My faith is with humanity.
Well, I agree with you up to a point. I think it's going to be quite a struggle because you've got very important, very powerful forces pushing all this. You've got a lot of geeks. No, I mean scientists who are brilliant. There's no question about the intellectual brilliance, the mechanical brilliance, but have not thought out or are not really interested in the ethical considerations or the effect it's going to have on our lives.
And there's the money. And, you know,
money.
If you find your nest of vipers, you know, that's absolutely, there are extremely powerful forces who are pushing this. And I think that, but where I say I have faith in humanity is I do have faith in the common sense of normal people. And I do have faith in our ability, once we all understand what the danger is, to say, hang on a minute, what's going on here? And to come up with some sensible ways to deal with this. So it's going to take time, but hey, Pluto moves slowly.
Very slowly. It's going to be there to what, the 2045? If I got that right, or is it more? I don't know. Who cares? But anyway, yep, it's going to be a slow evolutionary process. And ultimately, if you look at history, even disaster, we inevitably turn into an opportunity. We like to use the word transformation, don't we? But we don't have to use that word today. We can just say that there are recurring patterns. Astrology is one way of tracking those recurring patterns. There are plenty of really good astrologers out there who actually spend all their time relating those patterns to economics and to history. People like Andre Barbeau, the late Andre Barbeau, whose cyclic index anticipates all sorts of problems, including COVID-19, worth looking to.
Everything is always worth looking into. There is the curiosity that you have as a Gemini and that I have as Mercury and Gemini that takes us always into interesting territory.
And you shifted it away from the name, you elevated this into a broader philosophical conversation, Anna. You hijacked me. And I'm pleased that you did, because you raised me, so you raised my consciousness.
I think I'll have to put that down to having a sun in the ninth.
Ah, dear old ninth.
I can't resist the topical discussion. Well, as always, Victor, has been a delight. We never know where our conversations are going to go. I would say that that's one of the joys of doing Lightways. But some of my guests, let's just say, we get more adventurous than others. So thank you for your sense of curiosity and adventure.
And thank you, Anna, for inviting me back on your show. And let's push this video. If you agree with us, I'm doing a bit of party political broadcast now, promote it, you know, because we've had an interesting conversation today. And I think a lot of people will be thinking, yes, these things need to be said, particularly about media censorship and media propaganda. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
No. So if people want to learn more about your work, what do they do?
Well, as you know, I wrote the book, Chasing the Dragons, an introduction to Draconic Astrology. And I've written a book for entry point astrologers, you know, a very basic introduction. But contact me at victoroliver.co.uk. That's Oliver with 2 L's. I'm actually not taking any new clients just for the minute. I'm having a bit of a rest as I sort things out in my life. Interesting things are happening, but we won't go there. But victoroliver.co.uk, victoroliver.co.uk, write to me there. Take it from there.
And I will be putting a link to both the books as well as...
Oh, that's kind. Thank you.
Right. So you can find you.
Lovely to see you again, Anna. You're a voice of reason. You are, of course, a guru.
Oh, my goodness me. No, this is far too grand a title for me. Thank you.
Of course, I spell guru, G-O-O-R-O-O. Guru,
better.
Which I think sounds better. But no, you are a guru of sorts.
Thank you very, very much, Victor. And thank you for your time. Thank you all for watching. If you are interested in learning more about astrology, do remember you can also check out my website where you will find courses at different levels. So until next time, next time we are going to be looking at different house systems. Have a fantastic week and goodbye.
Bye-bye.